you very much, Assistant. Great. All right, well, let's get going. So a huge warm welcome to today's surgery. I'm Claire Mike. I'm Director of Technical and Business Development here at LEAF. And today we're going to be learning more about the multifunctional solutions and potential of peat within both conservation and farming, so both perspectives. And we're going to be doing that with today's very special guest, Dr. Julia Casperd, Senior Lecturer in Wildlife Conservation and Land Management and Chair of Harper University Environmental Sustainability Land and Soil Farm Group. So yeah, I'll be introducing you to Julia very shortly. Just before we get started, a little bit of housekeeping. We are recording today's session and we do encourage questions from our audience. So please do pop those into the chat function as normal. And my colleague, Victoria, who is joining me today, hi, Victoria, will help out in the Q&A session later on towards the end of today's surgery. So without any further ado, let me turn to today's guest, Julia. Julia, a very warm welcome to you, and thank you for agreeing to share your peat wisdom, and I'm sure much other wisdom with us on today's LEAF surgery. So let's start with a really simple question. I'd love you to introduce yourself, thank you, and tell us a little bit about how you got to where you are today.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for this invitation. It's great to be able to talk to you all. So my name's Julia Casperd, and I am a senior lecturer here at Harper. I have a very interesting career history, I would say. I started off kind of my interest in wildlife right back when I was a little child in Africa. So I was born in Africa, in Uganda, spent time out there and was surrounded by wildlife. So I've always been interested in wildlife. I am a behavioral ecologist. That is, sort of my default description of what I am, but I have many interests in land management and wildlife conservation. So I came back to England as a young child and spent a lot of time in Wales and Scotland, and I did my degree up in Dundee. So my stomping ground was the Cairngorms and the west coast of Scotland, the Highlands and Islands. And sort of my main interest at that point did focus on animals, which is very typical and typical of our students actually here at Harper. Our zoology students are just very interested in the animals, and we have to talk to them about the habitats and the soils and the important aspects that support the animals. But at that stage, that's what I was interested in. I went on to do a PhD, started off at UCL with Professor Robin Dunbar, in behavioral ecology of primates, but sort of evolutionary biology as well. So I was looking into what were the drivers of sociality and why do primates stay in social groups? How does that happen? What makes them cohesive? What are the post-conflict strategies that are involved in conflict resolution and managing relationships and so on? Fantastic, fascinating place to be working in the Department of Anthropology. I then moved up to Liverpool, completed my PhD, and then did a few different sort of jobs at Chester University and so on. And then I took time out to have a family. Came back into my career about 5-6 years ago, did a PGCE, got a lot of experience with Field Studies Council, which was amazing, upskilled. And then I really became interested in, how could the land be managed more sustainably? What could we do to support nature? What is landscape recovery? What can we do? And, the animals were part of that, but they weren't my main focus anymore. So then I ended up here at Harper after, working at Rees Heath as well, the university centre there. Two great land-based universities, well, Rees Heath is a centre, but Harper, the university. And I then, was fascinated by the fact we had this farm. It was like having a playground. We have this big 600+ hectare farm here at Harper. Literally come out of my office and there it is. So I started to explore, and that's how I became involved with the environmental sustainability group, looking at how the farm could actually, operate more sustainably and impact less on the environment as they transition to carbon net zero. And we even made a commitment to do that here at Harper by 2030. So yeah, I spent a lot of time in the first, and it was just after lockdown, so we're coming out and of lockdown, and people were still working at home quite a lot. So I had a lot of free time, and so I was out on the farm. I worked on the farm. I did lots of different things. So I went out at that point with the farm manager at the time, Scott Kirby, and we do have very peaty soils here at Harper Adams. And so we went to the south end of the farm, and he said we should be doing paludiculture here. I did not know what he was talking about. First time I heard that word back in 2022. So he explained that, these peaty soils were emitting, carbon into the atmosphere, not good for climate change, obviously, and that we should be managing them in a different way. I thought, oh, that's really, really interesting. And then he went on to say, we should have this living lab, and we should, have monitors, greenhouse gas monitors, and so on and so forth. And so we then met actually with Peat Lambert from Shropshire Wildlife Trust. So we worked really closely with them, and we started looking at ways in which lowland peat could be managed in a different way. Interestingly, I've always been really interested in upland peat, the moors up on the, in the highlands and so on. Absolutely gorgeous habitat and place to walk and so on. But, hadn't really considered the lowlands that much, but this really brought it home. We need to be doing something about this lowland peat that's degraded, that's emitting carbon dioxide, greenhouse gas emissions, and to try and manage it in a different way. So at that point it was really interesting, because we do stop me if you want to, because I could ramble on forever.
No, please carry on, this is fascinating.
Okay, so at that point there was an end of life project. So the Marches Mosses, which is literally about 20 minutes away from Harper, is I think it's the third biggest raised bog in the UK, and they had just finished their end of life project restoring that bog, an absolutely incredible landscape. And so we tendered and got the tender to actually put on their end of life project conference. So myself, Simon Jeffrey, Professor Simon Jeffrey here, Professor of Soils, and Scott Kirby, we got together with Shropshire Wildlife Trust and Natural England, and we put on that conference. And it was really that inspired us to drive this whole area of research on. And we sat down with Peat Lambert, and we over coffee, Scott, myself and Pete talked about the pockets of peat in Shropshire. We're very different in Shropshire to other areas of the UK and England, especially. So, the Fens, you've got this, peat that stretches for miles, black gold. I was there at the Fenland Soil Conference the other month, and literally it's just black, and you see these fields stretching for miles and miles. Well, not miles, but that's a bit of an exaggeration. But here in Shropshire, we have pockets and dips. When the glaciers retreated, we've got these pockets of peat. And here at Harper, back in the 1700s, it was like a mere. And we actually have a dugout canoe where people had to, travel across the mere to get to different places. And so when that was drained for agriculture, the landscape changed completely. And that's when obviously the carbon sink became a carbon source. And lots of greenhouse gas emissions started to head off into the atmosphere and affect global warming and so on. But yeah, so then we started thinking, right, well, we need to start applying for some grants. So the Paludiculture Exploration Fund came up, and we applied originally actually to deliver it, and NIAB were awarded the delivery of the grants. So then we were able to apply for one of the grants, which was probably better actually. So we ended up putting in for a grant, and we were successful, and we set up the Paludiculture Innovation Project. So we're very grateful to Natural England for that opportunity, and also to Shropshire Wildlife Trust and Severn Trent. So we did get a big pot of money from Severn Trent to actually do a feasibility study, because the idea was to create this project, this living lab, and we didn't know if we had enough water in order to re-wet these peaty soils to kind of mitigate and reduce those emissions. So the very first step, what good practice, is to do a feasibility study, and that was funded by Severn Trent, and Lucy Crockford did the sort of hydrology side of that, and she worked out that we did have enough water actually to re-wet the peat that we had there. And then off the back of that, we then went full steam ahead with the actual project, which was to set up a centre for research, education, training, knowledge exchange, and so on here at Harper, to look at sustainable ways of managing peat and what that looked like. So,
right, let me pause you there then. Wow, that's probably my favourite intro ever. So thank you so much, Julia. And gosh, you've gone from primates to peat. What a journey. And you've been around the world. And it's so interesting that some of the places that you went to, we know are, well known for peat, like Scotland, but how incredible that you find it at Harper Adams. So that's great. We're going to dig into that. Sorry, pardon the pun. We're going to not dig into that, let's say, in a moment. But can I take a little step back, because you've described some amazing things that are already happening there, and that is fascinating. Could you just share with us, from our point of view, why is peatland management and restoration so important? Let's get back to the basics and just make sure that, what is it that's so important here?
Well, I think to begin with, you need to remember that 3% of it doesn't sound very much, does it? But 3% of the world's land is covered in, has got peat, essentially. So peatlands, wetlands. Those peatlands are the biggest carbon store on land. Okay, so obviously the ocean is a huge carbon store as well. And we mustn't forget that, because, in terms of the worry about climate change, we need to remember that, these reducing the emissions on this farmed peat is not the only solution. It's one of the solutions. So yeah, significant carbon store. Peat is a massive carbon store, and as soon as it starts to be disturbed, it starts emitting sort of carbon emissions and other greenhouse gases as well, methane and nitrous oxide. The problem with peat in the lowlands, so uplands, the problem is once it's I think it's 80% of our peatlands in the UK have been affected somehow by some activities. You've got 20% left in natural or near natural condition. 80% is a lot of peatland, a lot of carbon stores that have been disrupted and are significant greenhouse gas emitters. So the key thing here is that in the lowlands, it's due to agriculture, it's due to farming, it's due to draining the land and actually farming it and tilling it and so on and so forth. So 11% of all greenhouse gas emissions in the UK are due to this agricultural lowland peat that's in a degraded condition. And 3% of that is coming from land that is farmed for crops, essentially. So it's significant in terms of the UK government's commitment to reducing carbon emissions, and that was reaffirmed at COP29. Something needs to be done about these emissions coming from lowland peat, and the issue is that in terms of food security, 1.29 billion pounds worth of food crops come off this grade 1, grade 2 agricultural land. The peaty soils are hugely fertile. They are great for producing high value crops, but potentially it's also a solution to climate change. So what do we do, and what is the balance? Because there has to be a balance here. As with anything in sustainability, it's not just about the environment, it's also about the economics, and it's also about the social human capital, that the social side of it, the people, and supporting our population. So yeah, in terms of why peatlands are important, that's one aspect of it. But they're unique ecosystems. They are hugely biodiverse, and their biodiversity is unique. We have 30 species of sphagnum in the UK. Sphagnum is beautiful. Sphagnum is one of the peat forming vegetations. Absolutely beautiful, and lots of other sundew plants, and different dragonflies, curlew, waterfalls, many species, adders, and so on, associated with these peatlands that are unique. So we've got the carbon store, you've got the biodiversity, but you've also then got the ecosystem services. So obviously reducing emissions is one, the biodiversity is another, but then you've got also the whole conversation around water and water quality. So and also flood mitigation. So peat is able to retain water. Sphagnum itself can retain up to, I think it's 20 times its own body weight in water. So that's what is forming our peat here in the main. And so they're very good at keeping the water back. However, when they're degraded, they lose that capacity. So up in the uplands, you've got the moors with huge gullies that have been created through erosion. As the peat dries out, the water can't be absorbed as easily, it runs off. And then obviously with peat extraction and other sort of practices, these massive, huge gullies that some can be as tall or taller than a human, like huge, some of them are absolutely immense. So there's an amazing work that has been done through the peat partnerships to restore those uplands, and there's still a lot of work to be done there. In the lowlands, so going back to the uplands, because quite often the uplands are sort of, in the source of water courses and so on. Water retention it is really important, and that will help flood mitigation further down in the lowlands. And also the peat act as a filter. So in terms of nutrient mitigation, it's really important that they're kept in good condition so that they are still delivering that ecosystem service, if you like. So yeah, I mean, peatlands are incredibly important, absolutely.
Yeah, thank you so much for walking us through that. And you make an excellent point in terms of it's about balance. We've got to find a balance here. That's really critical. So just reflecting on that maybe a little bit, how has our peatland management changed over the last 5 years, let's say, as we've become more aware of how our actions impact peat and its and all of the ecosystem services that you pointed out? And how do you, if you had a crystal ball, how do you see that developing over the next 5 to 10 years, given that we do need to have that approach of balance, let's say?
Yeah, I mean, balance is important in everything. I think, I was reflecting on this, the last 5 years, a lot has happened in terms of, policy, legislation to do with the environment, to do with climate change. So, the Environment Act came in 2021, I think it was, looking at how we could, support biodiversity. We are one of the most nature depleted nations in the world, and that's a little bit embarrassing, I'd like to say. As a country that has done so much to be one of the most nature depleted nations is not a very good advert. The Environment Act, which is being reviewed currently at the moment, was put in place to look at this. And then off the back of that, we had biodiversity net gain was made statutory in 2024. So developers have now got to deliver 10% gain on any development, which is a good thing. It's been a bit of a journey, I think. I've been involved in quite a few of those conversations around how it should be assessed. But essentially, it is a very good thing. And yeah, so there has been a lot. There are 2 huge reports that have come out that, in my mind, are very significant in this whole conversation about how lowland peat, in particular, should be used in a better way, and the sort of land use framework. And obviously, that's something that's up for review at the moment as well. But first of all, the Dasgupta report on natural capital and how potentially land could be supported and monetized, and in terms of natural capital. And then the second one was the Robert Cordwell's Lowland Peat Task Force report, which was back in 2023. So those two reports have come out in the last 5 years, considering how land might be used differently and how that could be supported financially. Because the problem with a lot of public support is that it's not very predictable. It's not always resilient, I'm going to say. It's yeah. So if private financing mechanisms can be refined and made to work, then that would be a help to the public purse and to make this more predictable for our landowners. So yeah, a lot of changes. Obviously, we've got targets in place for 2030 for biodiversity. We've got targets in place for 2050 for carbon. We need to be net zero. I'd like to think we would be negative. These are, the world is changing quickly. We need to do something about it. And our landowners and our farmers are part of that conversation. And government are trying to engage them in this conversation. And it's really important that we get it right for everybody concerned. And that requires everybody to work together, the conservationists, the ecologists, the farmers, the landowners, government. It's in terms of a crystal ball, the next 5 years. So, I think there's been a commitment to try and use 83% of peatlands more sustainably, lowland peat more sustainably, which would require potentially rewetting. So the one thing I would say, in terms of the Paludiculture Innovation Project, we're looking at what does the science look like behind that. We can't just say, everybody raise your water tables, because actually that isn't necessarily the right thing to be doing. One, for food security, but also because we don't really know quite yet what's going on with the methane and the nitrous oxide emissions. So carbon dioxide is one thing, but actually if you're going to raise the water tables and increase the nitrous oxide and methane emissions, then they're much more powerful greenhouse gases. So therefore, you might actually not be doing such a good job. So there are lots of things to consider, but going forward, there is potential to use peatlands in a more sustainable manner, to use lowland agricultural peatland in a new way, which would involve looking at novel crops potentially that can grow in wetter conditions, and also to look at what are the sort of thresholds for conventional crops, and whether this should be done on a grand scale. So for example, in the Fens, so Megan Hudson's doing fantastic work out there, looking, and they've got huge areas of peatland where they could raise the water table on their huge fields. In places like Shropshire, that's not necessarily going to be an option. You're going to be looking at a mosaic, and down at the Paludiculture Innovation Project site, we have a mosaic. We've got woodland, we've got a watercourse, and we've got a riparian zone, and we've got our conventional farming and our paludiculture site where the water table will be raised and also will be irrigating from above. So in my view, you've got to consider both options, potentially doing this high efficiency with potentially some inputs as well, because you're not going to get good crop yields unless you've got some inputs, and how are you going to reduce nutrient export if you do that, and so on and so forth. Or you do it as a mosaic of land use. So going forward, the next 5 years, I think, is about getting it right, at the end of the day, and it's about providing options for farmers, looking at opportunities, which is what the other project that we've just completed at Harper Adams, which was the Patchy Peat Solutions project, was all about, was identifying those opportunities and then looking at how farmers, landowners might actually exploit those opportunities in a way that actually would support their farm business. So yeah, I think it's going to be the next 5 years is going to be interesting to see what the uptake of the sort of different options in terms of rewetting are going to be. And obviously the SFI has now closed, and what happens to that will remain to be seen. But yeah, it's going to be about people working together, and it's got to be about collaboration at the end of the day.
Exactly. What a great point to end on there. So you've mentioned a plethora of projects already, Julia, and they all sound super exciting. Might there be any more that you can share with us, or do you have any examples of projects that you know that are happening around the world, for example, that we can learn from as well? Is there anything exciting happening out there as well?
Well, there are lots of things going on a global scale. In fact, we've had many conferences here at Harper actually over the last 2 years. So as part of the Paludiculture Innovation Project, we committed to do a lot of knowledge exchange, so workshops and conferences and symposia. And there's a gentleman, Harry, who has been out and done and looked at sort of farming on peatlands on a global level. Maybe you'd like to get him in for a chat sometime. But in terms of what's going on at Harper, the Patchy Peat Solution Project was another one which was really interesting. So that was looking at opportunities on lowland peat on a sort of landscape scale. And when you're looking at delivering, biodiversity and ecosystem services, you've got to do it on a landscape scale. You can't do it. You can obviously local action will lead to landscape action, but you've got to have multiple kind of local actions aggregated to get that landscape delivery. And so I was really keen to go ahead and kind of look at this more on a landscape scale. And so the Lowland Agricultural Peat Water Discovery Pilot grants came up, the Environment Agency grants came up. And Scott Kirby and I again sat down and we said, right, here's an opportunity to take this one step further and start looking on a landscape scale, what could be done with lowland peat. And so we were successful securing that grant, which was fantastic. And we had Simon Jeffrey again on board, and Carl Berent and Iona Huang, so Carl's our economist here at Harper, and Iona is our social scientist, and many, many other people. We've been very fortunate in these projects. We've had lots of support, and people have given time and financial commitments in kind to get these projects off the ground. But so the 6 farms that we looked at, all based in Shropshire and Staffordshire, were considering this pockety peat, this patchy peat, and how it could be managed. And so, yeah, it was really interesting. And I spent a lot of time talking to farmers, which I've not done actually ever. But I was brought into it as part of the farm business work package, as well as doing the biodiversity and so on. And it was so interesting. And I think my take-home message from that was, and I went out with Kate Main and I went out with Scott, and both of them farmers. And my mother was a smallholder, but I'm not, really from farming background. We're always interested. And the key thing is that once you start talking to farmers, you really understand what it is that engages them. They're sitting around the kitchen table, which is basically what we did, drinking coffee for 2 hours whilst we interviewed them to find out about their farm business and what they saw as their opportunities. And then we would maybe, and then we went on to do workshops. So we'd say, okay, you thought these are your opportunities. We think this is what your opportunities are. And what do you think of our, thoughts? So there were lots of discussions, and we did push them to the limits a little bit. But we found out an awful lot, and what were the key barriers and what were the key enablers potentially of that. And so we use lots of innovative technology, so satellite technology, and we tried to compare different things that might be available to farmers. So the Land app, for example, the Land app Biodiversity Net Gain Estimator tool is available to farmers, and the Land app do a lot of very, very good mapping, and it's freely available. A lot of it, not all of it, but a lot of it's freely available, and they support farmers in sort of managing their plans and things. So I was really interested to see how, if you went out and did an ecological survey and you came up with, you know, your measures of biodiversity, and then you worked out what biodiversity net gain could be found in these particular areas. What would that look like with the land app? So we are going to report on that. That was an interesting exercise. And then, you know, satellite surveying is available to farmers, to landowners, to look at their biodiversity and also their carbon. And how accurate is that? What, you know, and is that something we should be using, or do we need to refine it a little bit more? So there was a lot of really interesting data. We've literally just finished that project. And I can share some of it with you. I have got the okay to do that from the EA. And I should say we're really grateful to the EA. They've been brilliant in supporting us with this project. And we're hoping to go on and expand on this and take it further. But there were key things, I think, that came out of that project. One is the definition of peat is variable. So in terms of the England peat map, which has just been revised and just come out, the new revised edition, we were hoping to add to that, and we have to a certain extent, but it's not that simple, you know, especially when you have patchy peat. What you see on the surface is not necessarily what is found underground. So in terms of the volume of the carbon stock underground, measuring that is tricky. So we did do intensive soil sampling to a depth of just under 2 meters, I think it was. That was all analysed for soil organic carbon. And we basically considered anything between 10 and 20% soil organic carbon as peat. Anything below that was sort of peaty soils. So, but the definition varies, and if you want to know more about that, you need to ask Simon Jeffrey to come and have a chat. But yeah, so how is that going to be measured accurately? Currently, the forms of measurement are not hugely accurate, so that needs to be improved. The economics of it all, you know, how can farmers, if they were going to re-wet this peat and farm it in a different way, how cost effective is that? Well, for a start, it's very expensive well, the feasibility study needs to be done in the first instance, but also then the infrastructure requirements surrounding re-wetting. If you're going to raise the water table, you're looking at weirs, you need to get permissions in place. That takes time, and it takes a lot of money as well. It's very expensive. So all those sorts of things sort of need sorting out. But there are opportunities. So as part of the project, we were hoping to look at opportunities for monetizing carbon, nutrients, and biodiversity. So due to the timescale, it was a 1-year feasibility project, and we only really kind of were able to drill down on the biodiversity side of it. And we considered a number of sites on the farms. We looked at the hydrology, which was fascinating. I'll come back to the hydrology, remind me to come back to that. It's really important if I forget. But in terms of biodiversity, there are huge opportunities for biodiversity net gain on farms. So the farms that we looked at, and bearing in mind we only looked at a small area on each farm, there were opportunities of up to just under 700 biodiversity units of net gain. That's significant. Significant opportunity on some of the farms. There is up to 200% uplift that could be put in place. So there's huge opportunities there for gain in terms of biodiversity, which is obviously a really important ecosystem service. And in terms of the financial remuneration of this, now you know, you have to remember as well that this changes and will fluctuate. But we had we were very lucky. We had Legacy Habitat Bank gave their time in kind to look at what this gain might equate to financially, and basically across the farms there was an opportunity to have financial remuneration of between £1 and £4 million in terms of this biodiversity net gain. Yeah, so that was fascinating, and we will report on that. We're going to be publishing some papers looking at that. In terms of where is the market? Is there a carbon market? Obviously there's biodiversity net gain. We put on corporate roundtables, one corporate roundtable, and Richard Marignac and Wojtek Benke from Aqualate did a fantastic job getting corporates in the room and looking at, how could we engage the corporates in this conversation. to get them to invest their finances and support farmers at sort of, farming in a different way, or doing, looking at biodiversity net gain type options, carbon, etc., etc. In terms of the carbon, because of the whole sort of issues around measurement, it's not quite there. And I know the IUCN program are looking to try and solve this issue in order to monetize carbon. Nutrients as well, and the whole sort of conversation around stacking and bundling, it all needs sorting out. So there are opportunities, but the problem for the farmers is the risk. And this is one of the key things that came out of all the conversations. There were two things: risk and aggregation. So first of all, if you are asking a farmer to re-wet their land and farm it in a different way, or to re-wet it and create a wetland, is that reversible? What is that going to do to their land? What is it going to cost them if they have to reverse it? If they lose the public finance that supported them to do this, what do they do then? So the risk to this is something that needs to be mitigated. What does it cost to incentivize a farmer to operate in this way? So that was one thing. And the other thing was about aggregation. And a lot of our conversations would come back to water and water management. How can water be managed in the landscape more sustainably? It is a huge issue. And if you are going to re-wet on a grand scale, it needs to be done, there needs to be aggregation, and farmers need to work together, landowners need to work together in order to manage the water. So here in Shropshire, especially because for various reasons, but there's been a lot of abstraction from our aquifers. Our aquifers are hugely depleted, and water's been abstracted for drinking water, as well as for agriculture, but it's significant abstraction for drinking water, which has affected the levels of water in the aquifers. And this means that it's hard to replenish them. And we see this. I can go down to the south of the farm, and it will have water on the surface in the Peat areas. And then go down 2 weeks later, if the sun's been out and the weather's been good, you've got cracked peat there, literally. So it's really, really interesting. And the hydrology, it was fascinating. So we had Regare, Rob Lowe and Laura did a great job with our postdocs, looking at the hydrology of all 6 farms and how the water could be managed to re-wet the sites that we'd identified. If you've got depleted aquifers and you're not retaining water, then you're going to affect lots of things downstream in terms of low flows. And our problem is we've got flooding, huge flooding. So we're potentially taking water off at the wrong time of year, and we should be taking it off in the winter and storing it so that we can use it in the summer. The sort of abstraction licenses are a little bit topsy-turvy in most places, and also we need to look at potentially sharing licenses, permits and so on. And so there are lots of conversations I know around water abstraction groups, which is fantastic. And we need to get this right. The whole water conversation needs to be got right for many things, not just for the farmers and for farming and conventional farming and irrigation, but also for re-wetting, to do wetter farming, paludiculture, but also for flood mitigation. It's all linked and tied up together.
Well, that's an incredible amount of information, and thank you, Julie, for sharing that. And I had several more questions, but amazingly, you've managed to answer all of them in what you shared. So thank you for sharing so generously. It's a fascinating subject, and I know the audience, like me, will have been hooked on that, and I can tell by the questions that have come through. We are going to move to the audience now, if that's okay, and answer some of the questions that have come through the chat. We might only get to 1 or 2, but I know that, I hope that Julie would be keen to answer any further questions that anybody might have, that we can steer in Julia's direction after today's surgery as well. So please don't worry if your question hasn't been answered. I'm sure we can go to Julia and get that answer too. So So from my perspective, Julia, thank you. That I've learned so much there, and it is a fascinating subject. And I'm going to hand over to my colleague Victoria now. Victoria, can you field a question or two from the audience, please?
Yes, of course. Thank you. So, Julia, first up, does land classification need to be modernised, especially the protection of best and most versatile land within planning applications, in your view?
Oh, so we have got a review of the land use framework, haven't we? Does it need to be reclassified? Was that the question?
Yes, does land classification need to be modernised?
Modernised. Potentially, yes, potentially. I think there is scope for modernising it. I think for me as an ecologist, UK Hab has done a great job of actually looking at land use in terms of, with a statutory metric 4.0, with which you create your BNG, you work out how much biodiversity net gain you're going to need and the biodiversity credits and so on. The UK Hab does a great job of actually classifying the land in terms of land use. All the other aspects. So the other thing to remember is that the local nature recovery strategies which are coming, and we've got one here in Shropshire, Shropshire and Telford and Wrekin Council are working together on this, but we're all feeding into that at the moment. And in terms of the significance of land, they will be building on the UK Hab classification and be looking at all other aspects of the land also in terms of agriculture and development and so on, to then work out the strategic significance of the land. And that will be key in terms of biodiversity net gain as we go forward, because currently we're in the landscape character 61, and that's what we have to use for, which is quite a huge area actually, going through to Cheshire and so on, but that's what people have to use to estimate and to calculate their biodiversity net gain. But the local nature recovery strategy will be key in working out the strategic significance for our county, for Shropshire, and so that is part of the modernisation process, I think.
Okay, thank you. Next question.
Do one more, yes.
Yeah, so looking at the alternatives for peat as a growing medium, Julia, there seems to be pros and cons. In your opinion, which peat alternative offers the best value for growers?
That's really interesting. So there is a lot of interesting research going on into peat alternatives, and I'm probably not completely up on all of this. And I would refer you to Professor Jim Monaghan and Professor Dawn Arnold, who are looking into this more at Harper. So peat alternative, what I'm going to tell you about is the peat alternatives that I find really interesting. In many of the conferences that I've been to, there's this really fantastic guy called Alder. He's a farmer from Germany, and he farms Typha, and he's made Typha substitutes for peat. And he swears, he has all his samples, that 100% Typha is a good substitute for peat. So Typha is basically bulrushes. The bulrushes you see around the pond, and you harvest that and you turn it into this peat substitute. Yeah, also, I'm presuming we're talking horticulture here, aren't we? We are, aren't we, in terms of peat substitute? Yeah. So obviously compost is a great sort of alternative. I mean, like, from a gardener, and I'm a gardener, good compost is good too. But yeah, you need to talk to Jim and Dawn about peat substitutes, I think, if you want more in-depth conversation around that.
Thank you, Julia. I think that's all we have time for on questions, isn't it, Claire?
Yes, unfortunately. Like I say, though, please do reach out to us if you have any more questions. Yeah, I think we've got another peat surgery upcoming, obviously, Julia, by the sounds of things. So yeah, thank you again. Wow, what a fascinating surgery. Your wisdom and your experience and the projects that you're working on are so valuable, and we really do appreciate that. So yes, just to draw the surgery to an end for today, thank you all so much for joining us. Please do join us for our next leaf surgery on Friday the 9th of May, although you will all remember that I'm not very good at dates, hence several surgery invites. But yeah, Friday the 9th of May, where we will be welcoming guests from King's Play Farming, who are launching as a leaf demonstration farm next week. So yeah, we're going to be really excited to speak to Lucy and Nick Tyler, who are going to share with us what they are doing on their incredibly proactive, forward-thinking dairy farm. So please do join us for that. In the meantime, I wish you all a wonderful rest of your Friday. I have popped in the post. I said peaceful or peatful Friday. And yeah, thank you for joining us. Have a good rest of your day. And again, thank you, Julia. That's been brilliant.
Thank you. Bye-bye.